Now let's try and make common sense of what on earth is going on in international affairs with Colonel Simon Diggins. He's a military and defence analyst and a former defence attaché in Kabul. Simon, thank you so much for joining us.
Julian, good afternoon to you.
Lots to get through, lots of different parts of the world actually. But let's start with Vladimir Putin's sort of rather shock visit to North Korea. It's the first time in 24 years he is going to be meeting with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. What's the significance of this? What can we read into it?
Well, it's part of a process that he's been engaged on for a while to try and create an alternative, what he sees as the Western domination of the world. So we've seen him make alliances with China, seen him make alliances with Iran, and also, if you recall, there was a visit by the North Korean president into Russia himself, where he went around various arms factories and was shown various things as well. So this is a sort of return meeting, but it is important because a lot of information now coming through that North Koreans are starting to supply the Russian military with arms and ammunition for fighting their war in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have said they've identified North Korean shells being used against them. And in exchange for that, North Koreans are looking to Russia for kind of high-end technology, satellite technology, even perhaps developing of submarines in order to give themselves what they regard as their protection. So it's part of that kind of reaching out by Putin for that.
It is extraordinary to me that North Korea apparently, can provide a load of arms to Russia in their war against Ukraine and things, and yet they can't provide enough food for their people. I mean, we know that there is mass starvation on a regular basis in North Korea. It's a completely corrupt, non-functioning state, and yet they have this know-how. And this ability to churn out these weapons in a way you'd think, no. Why would Russia need North Korea's help?
Basically, because even despite the fact that the Russian economy has been turned onto a kind of war footing basis, the figures suggest that 1/3 of all Russian government expenditure is currently on the military. Yeah. Nonetheless, they still can't produce enough to conduct what is, particularly in the Ukraine, very much kind of artillery war. I mean, literally, so tens of thousands of rounds are used on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And even Russian war production can't match that. The North Koreans had and have massive war stocks, and they're passing those across to the Russians and protecting them in terms of that. So that's kind of what's going on with that one.
How concerned should we be about this sort of axis of evil of, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans and China? How much do they helping each other out, egging each on? How much do their interests align, and how big a threat are they?
They are a threat. It's curious because in many respects their interests are fairly disparate. I mean, the Russians are no fan of Muslim separatists. I mean, they've got their own issues
they've massacred Muslim separatists in Chechnya.
Absolutely. So they're not great friends of the Muslim world. Though there has been some interesting sort of rapprochements into Tatarstan and also into Afghanistan, which they were kicked out of, not least which in Afghanistan. This is curious because of the attack by again Islamist group ISIS-K into the Moscow theatre, which killed 144 people. And so Russia's kind of reached over the top of them because ISIS-K are based in Afghanistan and say we can be your friends for the future. But they're really trying to find an alternative world system. I mean, it can be really basic stuff, like, for example, the financial system. They find themselves in a difficult. It's one way why the sanctions have had an effect, or I won't say it's completely effect. Have had an effect is because all major transactions go through a European system, and so they're easier to trace. So they were trying to create an alternative payment system for international payments, which doesn't go through. They call it the SWIFT system, which they can use. So there is a sort of attempt to try and create, and they call it a Eurasian bloc that's distinct from the West.
But again, you've got countries supposedly neutral like India who are kind of allowing that, and again taking in all the Russian oil, dealing with it, and then, oh, what a surprise, sending it back to the West and we're buying it. It's like, oh, isn't it amazing how we're getting all our oil from India now, even though they don't really produce that much oil, but there we are. Let's talk about what's happening in Russian mainland, though, because we've got now we know the news about this closed trial, a sham trial, there aren't proper trials in Russia, of Evan Gershkovich. He's the Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested in March of 2023 while on a reporting trip in Yekaterinburg in Russia. He's been held in a Moscow prison ever since. He's going to be transferred to a new prison, but big concerns. He's on trial on bogus espionage charges. Basically a political prisoner, a hostage, many are calling him. He's obviously Wall Street Journal, part of the group of media organisations that Talk is a part of, very eager to get his safe return. But how concerned are you about this trial now going ahead behind closed doors?
but it's their standard way of dealing with what they call espionage cases. So there's nothing new particularly in that. What is new is the arrest of a journalist. The last time this actually happened was in 1986, so really at the height of the Cold War. And what they have done over recent years is made it harder and harder for foreign journalists or any journalists to actually report freely on what they're doing. He was apparently caught close to a tank production facility. He claimed this was perfectly legitimate in terms of understanding what was going on in terms of the war. But in this kind of this sort of heightened paranoid atmosphere that's ongoing in Russia at the moment, this was regarded as spying. And what Putin's offered to do is to swap him for one of their kind of proxy assassins who murdered a Georgian dissident leader in Berlin. And Putin, this again shows you so much what Putin thinks. He regards this as a kind of spy swap. We've all seen the story of the Bridge of Spies and the rest of it. He just sees it as a spy swap. He regards Gershkovich as a spy. One of their assassins was caught banged to rights in Western Europe. So we'll just do a swap. And for Putin, that's like business as usual. You don't harm other people, but that's how he's looking at it.
I mean, frankly, we're just lucky he's still alive, given how Putin deals with pesky journalists and others. So we just wish him very, very well. I can't imagine what he and his family and his colleagues are going through. Just finally, I just want to touch on the Middle East if I can, because while I've got you here as a military analyst, we've got lots of changes going on in Israel in the war cabinet there with Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think that this is going to be looking more like as a chance of or an opportunity for a ceasefire that would hold in Gaza, or are your concerns now shifting to the northern border and Hezbollah?
I mean, I think both concerns are very real concerns. I mean, the removal of people and the dissolution of his war cabinet. The war cabinet existed really to try and bring in people who weren't his political allies, but nonetheless had experience and kind of give the picture as it is correct in many respects. That this was a national war for survival and everything went with that. But I think they felt they had to leave because there was no coherent post-war fighting or post-fighting strategy for Gaza. So it leaves him politically somewhat exposed, exactly at the time, as you just pointed out, when there is now a heightened conflict in the northern border, and Hezbollah and Israel are exchanging fire across the border in a way that we haven't necessarily seen since the beginning of things. So it comes at a very critical time, and it really brings back to this message we've had from the beginning that these wars are all linked together. So how Israel deals with Hezbollah, the issue of Hamas and Fatah, Gaza and everything goes in, and in the background, how we deal with Iran are all linked together. And now this linkage is very clear. Hezbollah said there will be no ceasefire arrangement with Israel until there's a peace settlement in Gaza, and in Iran is sitting there going, what's the future? I mean, I think Hezbollah and Israel want an understanding, and other people are looking to try and do this, but how it works out, how it plays out, is very difficult at exactly the point when Netanyahu is now politically weaker than he's been before. So it's a very complex picture.
Really great to get your input on all of those big topics. Simon Diggins, military and defence analyst, thank you for that.